470 people walked into a concrete outbuilding in the Nevada desert between October of 1977 and October of 1987, and the only reason your planet is still turning is that the things waiting on the other side of the room decided, for the moment, that 470 was enough. My name is Samuel Brennan. I was 29 years old in October of 1977, a captain in United States Air Force Intelligence, assigned to the Strategic Air Command at Offutt Air Force Base outside Omaha, Nebraska. I came up out of a small steel town in western Pennsylvania, a place called Vandergrift, where my father had worked the rolling mill for 31 years, and where I had spent my boyhood watching the river run brown in the spring, thaw and orange in the summer when the mill was running hot. I went to Penn State on a Reserve Officer Training Corps scholarship and came out the other end with a degree in physics and a commission. I had wanted to be a pilot. The eye doctor at Wright-Patterson told me my vision was a half-line shy of what they needed in a man who would be expected to land a fighter aircraft on a moving deck, and so I went into intelligence instead. I did not complain. I have never been a man who complains. I had been married 3 years to a woman named Joan. She was from Lincoln. We had met at a base function in the spring of 1973. She wore a blue dress and laughed at something I said about the punch, and that was the beginning of it. We were trying to have a child in the fall of 77. We did not yet know that we never would. That is the man I was when the colonel arrived. I remember the day because it was the morning after I had stayed up late watching coverage of the Skylab orbital decay projections on the late news. I was tired and a little dull around the edges, which was not my usual condition, and I came into the office at 0700 to find an unfamiliar bird colonel sitting in my chair drinking coffee out of my mug. He stood when I came in. He introduced himself as Colonel Pierce. He did not give a first name. Captain Brennan, he said. Get your hat. We have a flight at 0900. I had not been informed of any flight. This is informal, he said. If it goes well, it becomes formal in about 4 days. If it does not, you will be back at this desk by Friday, and we will not speak of it again. Either way, your direct chain has been informed that you are temporarily detailed. They will not ask questions. You will not call your wife from where we are going. She will be told you are at a conference at Eglin. I asked what kind of conference. Get your hat, Captain. We flew from Offutt to Nellis Air Force Base, outside Las Vegas, on a small unmarked transport with 2 other officers I had never met. Neither of them spoke during the flight. We landed in the late afternoon and were driven by closed van to a barracks at a fenced section of the base I had not known existed. For the next 4 days I was interviewed. I was interviewed by men in civilian clothes who asked me questions about my politics and my drinking and my marriage and my faith. I was interviewed by a psychiatrist who asked me whether I had ever considered taking my own life and whether I had ever struck a woman or an animal. I was interviewed by a man with no insignia who asked me what I would do if I were ordered to participate in an action that I believed to be morally wrong but legally permissible. I told him I would obey the order and request a review through channels. He nodded and made a note. On the morning of the 4th day, Colonel Pierce came to my barracks room before breakfast. He had not slept. I could tell because the skin under his eyes had the particular slack quality of a man who has been awake for 36 hours and has resigned himself to it. You are in, he said. The other 2 are on a plane home. They have signed papers indicating that this assessment did not occur. So will you in about 20 minutes. I asked what the assignment was. You will be briefed in pieces, he said, over the next 18 months. By the time you have the whole picture, you will already have done things that prevent you from leaving. That is the design. I am telling you this because you are a smart man, and you would figure it out yourself by month 3. The choice you are making this morning, Captain, is the only choice you will get to make freely in this program. After this, you do what you are told. I asked if I could call Joan. No. I signed the papers. There were certain things in the air that fall that I want to put down for the record, because they matter for what came after. The Church Committee hearings on domestic intelligence abuses had wrapped only a year and a half earlier. The Senate had spent the better part of 1975 and 76 pulling out by the roots all the things the agencies had been doing in the dark, and the country was in a particular mood about it. There was a kind of national exhaustion. The Carter administration had come in promising sunlight and was finding that sunlight made the public uncomfortable when applied evenly. The MKULTRA documents had been released to the press in August of 77. People who had been dosed without their knowledge in the 1950s were filing lawsuits. The Vietnam draft evaders had just been pardoned in January. Voyager 1 launched in September on its way out to Jupiter and beyond, carrying a gold record of greetings in 55 languages, and the news anchors used the word optimistic when they talked about it. I bring all of this up because the country was, that autumn, in the worst possible posture to be told what I was about to be told. The agencies had just been embarrassed for things vastly smaller than this. The political climate would not survive the revelation. Pierce understood that. The men above him understood that. The reason there was a program at all, and the reason it was buried so deep that the budget line came out of a contingency fund at the Department of Energy rather than the Department of Defense, was that nobody at the cabinet level believed the country could absorb the truth in 1977 without coming apart. I am not making excuses. I am telling you what they thought. I have had 49 years to think about whether they were right. I was driven from Nellis to a facility called Lateral Site 4 on the night of October 12, 1977. The convoy was 3 vehicles. We left the base at 2200 and drove north and west into the high desert for about 2 hours. I did not see road signs. The driver took a series of unmarked turns onto dirt access roads. The third vehicle in the convoy was a fuel truck. The second was a closed cargo van. The first was the sedan I was in, with Pierce in the front passenger seat and a security officer named Sergeant Briscoe driving. Briscoe was a heavy-set man of about 35 with thinning sandy hair and a habit of clearing his throat every few minutes. He did not speak to me on the drive. Pierce did not either. We came up over a low-rise sometime near midnight, and I saw the facility for the first time. It looked like a small remote oil field operation. 6 low buildings inside a chain-link perimeter, a water tower, 2 sodium vapor lights at the gate. The buildings were poured concrete with metal roofs. There was a flagpole with the colors lowered. There was a Quonset hut at the south end that I would later learn was the mess. There was an unmarked road that led off behind the main structure to nothing in particular. The land beyond the fence ran flat in every direction for miles, broken only by the dark shapes of the Pintwater Range to the east. The cover designation on the gate sign said U.S. Department of Energy Soil Remediation Test Facility 4. The real name of the place was not posted anywhere. I learned in the briefings over the next 3 days that we were 80 miles north of the Nevada test site main gate, on land that had been quietly transferred to Department of Energy Administrative Control in 1974 as part of a soil management research authorization that nobody outside a very small office in Germantown, Maryland had ever read. The transfer paperwork existed. It would survive any audit. The actual purpose of the site was a separate compartment, and the compartment had been built specifically to be invisible from inside the Department of Energy itself. Pierce introduced me to the team over the course of those 3 days. Dr. Eleanor Vance was the senior physicist. She was 44 years old, originally from Boston, with degrees from MIT and a previous appointment at Lawrence Livermore. She wore her hair short. She smoked unfiltered Camels at a rate of about 30 a day, and she drank coffee from a chipped enamel cup she had brought from home. She greeted me by saying that she hoped I had a strong stomach and a weak conscience, because I would need them both. She did not smile when she said it. She did not smile at any point during the first month I knew her. Dr. Aaron Holloway was the medical lead. He was 49, a former Army surgeon who had been pulled out of a residency oversight role at Walter Reed. He had a heavy gray mustache and the careful, slow movements of a man who had operated on people for a long time. He shook my hand and asked me whether I had any food allergies he should know about. I said no. He nodded and made a note in a small, green, spiral notebook he carried in his breast pocket. He always carried that notebook. He always made notes in it. I will tell you later what happened to the notebook. Lieutenant Owen Riley was 24 years old. He was the youngest member of the team. He had been recruited out of a linguistics program at Georgetown where he had been studying acoustic phonetics and the perception of meaningful sound. He was tall and thin, and he had the kind of pale skin that did not tan in the desert, even after a year. His hands were already shaking when I met him. I noticed it because he was holding a glass of water at the time, and the surface of the water was trembling. I thought it might be a nervous condition. I learned later that he had been on site for 61 days, and that the tremor had begun on day 12, and that it would never fully leave him. Reverend Charles Doss was the chaplain. He was an Army major, 60 years old, Episcopal, originally from a small town in South Carolina. He had served in Korea as a battlefield chaplain. He had buried a great many people. He had the steady kind of presence that men who have done difficult work for a long time sometimes have. He shook my hand and said welcome, and that was all he said to me on the first day. I would later realize that this was already becoming a man who used words sparingly. Colonel Pierce, I have already described. He was 49 years old, a career intelligence officer, and the man who had been given the unenviable task of building this program out of nothing in the weeks after the breach event. He was a Catholic, lapsed, originally from Chicago. He had a wife and 2 grown daughters whom he saw twice a year. He drank in private and did not drink in public. He had a small framed photograph of his daughters on his desk in the administrative building. He had no other personal effects in the facility. There were also security personnel under Briscoe, technical staff under Vance, and a small support cadre. By the time I arrived, the total staff on site numbered 31. By the time the program ended, it would have rotated through 174 cleared personnel across the 10 years. 42 of those would die before 1990 in ways that the department would categorize as natural or self-inflicted. The actuarial tables for cleared personnel on Project Threshold ran considerably ahead of the curve for comparable populations. This was noticed. It was not addressed. I was given a barracks room in the smaller of the 2 residential buildings. I unpacked a duffel bag containing 6 changes of clothes, a shaving kit, a paperback copy of Robert Caro's The Power Broker that I had been reading on the flight, and a photograph of Joan in a small frame. I put the photograph on the nightstand. I sat on the bed. I waited to be told what I was actually here to do. I waited 2 more days. On the morning of October 15th, Pierce called me into his office at 0800 and told me what had happened at Lateral Site 4 6 weeks earlier. The facility had been built originally in 1974 as a Department of Energy research site for the study of high-energy resonance phenomena. The official purpose involved certain experimental techniques in particle physics that I will not attempt to describe here because Vance, on multiple occasions, made clear to me that I would not understand them and that my misunderstanding could only embarrass us both. What I can tell you is that on the afternoon of September 2nd, 1977, a scheduled experimental run produced a result that was not predicted by any of the existing models. A standing distortion appeared in the air of the buried experimental chamber. The distortion was approximately 7 feet tall and 3 feet wide. It was vertical. It had a faintly visible edge, as though the air itself was being held back from some other region of space. The chamber was sealed during the test and continued to be sealed afterward. The distortion did not move. It did not dissipate. It did not show what was on the other side. It was just there. The initial response was confusion. The department contacted the Lawrence Livermore team that had designed the experimental protocol. They contacted the Princeton Physics Department through back channels. They contacted a small group at Los Alamos. Nobody had any framework for what had occurred. There were theoretical papers about vacuum metastability and about closed time-like curves, and about a number of other things that turned out to have no application to the actual phenomenon. The distortion sat in the chamber for 9 days while the assembled physicists argued about what to do with it. On the night of September 11th, a technician on the night shift named Howard Greaves was alone in the monitoring booth above the chamber when he began to hear something. He described it later in a deposition that was eventually destroyed as a vibration in his teeth. He said the vibration had pattern. He said the pattern had intention. He said, and this is the part that put him in psychiatric care for the rest of his life, that the vibration was trying to speak and that it almost succeeded. Greaves got out of the booth and ran. He told the security officer at the door what had happened. The security officer thought he was having a breakdown and called for medical. By the time the on-call physician arrived, Greaves was unable to form coherent sentences. He was evacuated to a closed psychiatric facility at Patrick Air Force Base. He never recovered. He died there in 1981 of pneumonia. I never met him. But the recording equipment in the booth had been running. The audio engineers who reviewed the tape found nothing on standard playback. They found nothing on speed adjustment. They found nothing on frequency analysis through the normal audio range. It was a man at MIT in early October who finally suggested that the pattern vibration Greaves had described might not be acoustic at all in the usual sense. It might be an effect produced by the distortion on the air at frequencies that were not sound, but that the human inner ear could nevertheless transduce into something like sound when in close enough proximity. The MIT man designed a piece of equipment to listen at those frequencies. The department built it. They lowered it into the chamber on October 4th. The equipment heard the pattern vibration. It was speech. It was not in any language anyone could identify, but it had the statistical properties of speech, phonemes, word boundaries, sentence breaks. Something was talking. Something on the other side of the distortion was talking, and had been talking, since at least September 11th, and possibly since the beginning. The department went looking for someone who could listen. They found Owen Riley at Georgetown. His doctoral work involved a technique he had developed for recognizing meaning in degraded audio. He could hear sentence shape and emotional content in recordings that other listeners heard as noise. He was 24. He was unmarried. He had no living family. He had the security profile they needed. He was on a plane to Nevada within 9 days of being identified. He went down into the chamber on October 8th. He spent 47 minutes in proximity to the distortion. He came back up with a list of 17 words he was confident he had heard, written in his own phonetic notation. He did not know what the words meant. He could hear them. They had stress patterns. They had contour. He went down again the next day, and the next, and the next. By the time I arrived on October 12th, Riley had been going down into the chamber for 4 days. The team was beginning to construct a working vocabulary. What Pierce told me that morning of October 15th in his office was that the entities had begun communicating intelligible content the night before. They had communicated a demand. I went down into the chamber for the first time on the afternoon of October 16th. The descent was a steel staircase set into a concrete shaft. There were 44 steps. I counted them. The shaft was lit by single overhead bulbs at each landing, of the kind that hang in basements. The walls were rough, poured concrete. The air got colder as I went down, and the air got drier, and there was a faint smell I did not recognize at the time, and that I have not been able to describe accurately since. It was not chemical. It was not biological in any sense I knew. It was an absence. It was the smell of air that had not been air recently. I do not know how else to put it. Pierce went first, then Vance, then me, then Riley. Sergeant Briscoe stayed at the top of the shaft and closed the security door behind us. The chamber at the bottom was a poured concrete room about 30 feet by 40 feet, with a ceiling about 14 feet high. There was an observation window of thick safety glass set into the wall opposite the staircase, and behind the window was the monitoring booth where Greaves had been sitting on the night he heard the vibration. The booth was empty now. The instruments inside it were running. I could see a pair of reel-to-reel tape recorders turning. I could see a long roll of paper coming out of an oscillograph and being collected slowly in a basket on the floor. The distortion was in the center of the room. I want to be careful here, because the first thing I have to tell you is that the human eye and the human mind do not handle the distortion well, and any description I give you will be partially wrong. It was vertical. It was approximately the height and width of a doorway. It had no frame, no edge, no border in any straightforward sense. The air on either side of it was perfectly normal air. The air inside it, if you can call what was inside it air, was not. There was a kind of bending, there was a kind of pulling. If I held my hand up at arm's length and looked at the wall behind the distortion did not look like a continuation of the wall on either side. It looked like a wall in a different room. Not a different wall. The same wall in a different room. I do not know how to explain it any better than that. The geometry of what was on the other side of the distortion did not match the geometry of the side I was standing on. The chamber I was in had right angles. The chamber on the other side did not. I stood there for some time, looking at it, while Pierce and Vance went over to the monitoring booth and conferred with the technician inside. I noticed, after a while, that I had stopped blinking. I noticed, after a while longer, that my mouth had filled with a taste of metal. Specifically, the taste of a small steel hex nut I had once held between my teeth as a child while I was helping my father work on the family Plymouth. The taste was perfectly specific. I had not thought of that hex nut in 20 years. I had no reason to be tasting it. The taste sat on the back of my tongue and would not go away. Riley came over and stood next to me. He had a clipboard. He was wearing headphones connected by a long cable to a device on his belt. "Captain," he said quietly, "if you start to feel like the floor is tilting, that is normal. If you start to hear someone talking who you cannot see, that is not normal. Tell me right away. We will go up." I asked him whether he heard anyone talking right now. "Yes," he said. I asked him what they were saying. "They are commenting on you," he said. "They are noting that you are new. They are noting your dimensions. They are noting other things about you that I am still working out." I asked him what other things. He did not answer me immediately. He looked at the distortion, and his hand on the clipboard was shaking, and the pen on the clipboard was rattling against the metal clip. "I am still working that out, sir," he said. We went back up after 20 minutes. My ears were ringing as we climbed the staircase. The taste of metal in my mouth lasted until the next morning. I have, on 3 occasions, in the years since, woken up in the middle of the night with that taste in my mouth and the absolute certainty that I am being looked at by something that is not in the room. I have learned to drink a glass of water and wait it out. The taste always goes away. The feeling does not always go away. On the morning of October 17th, Pierce convened the entire cleared staff in the larger of the 2 conference rooms and told us what the entities had communicated. Riley read the translation from his clipboard. His voice was steady. I will give it here as he gave it to us, in the order in which the words had come. 47 living subjects per year, 10 years, delivered intact to the threshold. Specific neurochemical criteria to be provided. Failure of delivery results in escalation. Compliance maintains current configuration. The agreement is not negotiable. The agreement begins upon acceptance. The deadline for acceptance is the next setting of the sun on this position. There were 18 of us in the room. Nobody spoke for a long time. After Riley finished, I could hear the ventilation system. I could hear a fly somewhere near the ceiling. I could hear Vance's lighter clicking as she lit a Camel. Pierce spoke first. "We have until sunset," he said. "Dr. Vance has been working on what escalation might mean. Doctor, would you brief us, please?" Vance did not stand up. "Escalation," she said, "could mean a number of things. The distortion currently occupies a fixed point in space. It does not appear to be moving. It does not appear to be capable of moving. The entities behind it appear, based on Lieutenant Riley's translations, to be bound to it in some way. They cannot come through. They have stated this in several different formulations. They want subjects delivered to them. This implies a constraint that they are working within." She paused. She tapped ash into her enamel cup. "However," she said, "the existence of the distortion is itself a violation of what we previously thought was possible. We have no theoretical basis for predicting what they can or cannot do under conditions of non-compliance. Lieutenant Riley, when you have asked them what escalation means, what have they communicated?" Riley looked at his clipboard. "They have communicated 3 responses to that question in 3 separate sessions," he said. The first response was, quote, additional thresholds. The second response was, quote, the wider entry. The third response was a phrase I have not been able to fully translate, but which I believe means approximately the unbinding. Nobody spoke. In context, Riley said, I believe they are telling us that what we are currently dealing with is a constrained presence, a small breach. They are telling us that non-compliance will result in a larger breach. I do not know how much larger. I do not know what they are capable of through a larger breach. But I do not believe they would tell us about it if it were nothing. Holloway raised a hand. He looked tired. The criteria, he said. The neurochemical criteria. Have they provided those yet? Yes, Riley said. He looked at his clipboard again. They have provided a description of a compound. They have provided a method for detecting its presence in human tissue samples. They have indicated that the subjects must be living, that the subjects must be intact, and that the subjects must have produced the compound in measurable quantities within the 72 hours prior to delivery. Holloway asked what the compound was. They have not given it a name we can use. Riley said, I have been calling it the M compound in my notes. We will need to identify it ourselves. They have given us the detection method. That is enough to start. Pierce stood up. We have 8 hours to give them an answer, he said. I want a working group to begin synthesis of the detection method immediately. Dr. Holloway, that is you and Dr. Vance. I want Lieutenant Riley back at the threshold to verify any clarifying questions. I want the rest of you to think about what you would do if you were sitting in my chair. Because in 5 hours, I will go to the secure phone, and I will recommend to the people I report to either acceptance or refusal, and I would like to hear from each of you before I make that recommendation. He looked at the room. This is the only briefing in which I will ask for your opinions on a matter of this kind, he said. I want you to understand that. Take it seriously. He sat back down. We took it seriously. I will not describe the conversations of the next 5 hours in any detail. I will say that the consensus reached by the 18 of us in that room was that we recommended acceptance. We recommended it not because we believed it was right. We recommended it because we did not believe that anyone in Washington had the standing to refuse on behalf of a planet that did not know it was being negotiated for. We recommended it because Vance, by the end of the second hour, had become persuaded that the unbinding language was specific and that the entities could, if they chose, widen the breach to something we would not survive. We recommended it because Holloway had spent 20 minutes trying to articulate what an alternative recommendation would even look like, and had failed. I voted yes. I am putting that on the record because it matters to me that I put it on the record. I did not abstain. I did not vote against. I voted yes. Pierce went to the secure phone at 15:30. He returned at 16:45. He had been authorized to communicate acceptance. Riley went down into the chamber at 17:10. He communicated acceptance. The entities communicated acknowledgement. The agreement began. The sun set at 18:04 that evening. I watched it from the steps of the administrative building. The desert turned the color of an old penny. The mountains went dark first. The sky was a green I had not seen before and have not seen since. I knew, watching that sun go down, that I would never sleep an unbroken night again in my life. I was right about that. The next 48 hours were spent identifying the compound. Holloway and Vance worked through the protocol the entities had provided. Riley went back to the chamber twice to clarify ambiguous notation. The detection method required a small biopsy of cortical tissue, which Holloway said was not survivable as a screening tool for living subjects. So they spent 6 hours arguing about whether the entities had simply not understood that we needed a less invasive method, or whether they had understood and were indifferent. They settled on the second possibility. Holloway then went to work on an indirect screening method using urine and blood markers that would correlate with the cortical compound's presence at levels above a threshold. The compound itself, when they isolated a reference sample from a postmortem tissue donation that Holloway had requisitioned through channels I never asked about, turned out to be a previously unknown molecule that formed only in specific neuronal cells in the human neocortex. It formed only during certain kinds of sustained brain activity. It formed during dreaming. It formed during certain kinds of creative cognition. It formed when a person was, as Holloway put it, on the day he finished the workup, doing the thing that humans do, that nothing else on this planet does. The thing where we build stories in our heads. The thing where we see things that are not there, and where we make patterns out of nothing, and where we narrate our own lives to ourselves. The compound was the chemical signature of that activity. It existed nowhere else in the known biological universe. It could not be synthesized using any of the techniques available to us. It degraded within minutes of cellular death. The entities could only get it one way, and that one way was the only way. Holloway named the compound metheric acid. He chose the name himself. He said in his small green notebook, which I read for the first time 21 years later, that he chose it because the Greek root for myth was the closest word he could find for what the chemical represented. He said in the notebook that he was aware of the irony. He said that he was aware that he was naming the thing that made us human after the thing that we would lose 470 times to keep being human at all. He wrote that on the night he finished the workup. He wrote it in pencil. He underlined the word irony twice. I was not told about the compound's full implications for almost 2 weeks. Pierce briefed the operational staff on a need-to-know basis, and I was told only what I needed to begin the work I was being assigned. I was being assigned to recruitment. I want to be honest about my reaction when Pierce told me that. I was relieved. I was relieved because I thought for about an hour that recruitment meant finding the donors. I thought it meant approaching people and explaining the program in some sanitized form and offering some kind of compensation and getting their consent. I knew, as I sat in Pierce's office and listened to him tell me that I would be running the recruitment program, that I would not be doing the part of the work that involved walking subjects to the chamber. I would be in an office somewhere. I would be moving paper. I would be far from the threshold. I felt the relief settle in my chest like a warm drink. Pierce watched me feel it. "Captain," he said, "you do not yet understand what recruitment means in this program. I am about to explain it. I want you to listen to all of it before you say anything." He explained it. The entities required 47 living subjects per year. The entities required that those subjects have measurable quantities of metheric acid in their tissues at the time of delivery. The entities did not require, and had explicitly declined to require, that the subjects consent. The entities also did not require, and had explicitly declined to require, that the subjects be people of a particular demographic, social class, or institutional status. The criteria were chemical. The criteria were neutral. The constraint on us, on the other hand, was not neutral. The constraint on us was that we could not take 47 people per year out of the American population without those 47 people being missed. We could not take Methodist housewives and college sophomores and Boeing engineers and have the disappearances go unreported. We could not take anyone whose absence would generate a missing persons file that anyone would follow through with seriousness. We could not take anyone whose family would hire a private investigator. We could not take anyone whose employer would call the senator's office. We could not take anyone whom the press might one day get curious about. The math of this constraint was very simple. There were a certain number of people in the United States in 1977 who could go missing without anyone competent looking for them. We were going to take from that population, we were going to take very specifically from that population the subset whose neurochemistry met the criteria. Pierce called this population, the cover phrase he used in briefings to staff outside the inner circle, the vagabonds and the outcasts. He said it without inflection. He said it the same way he would have said any operational designation. He used the phrase because it was deniable and because it was, in a certain reading of the data, accurate. The people we would take were vagrants, transients, runaways, people who had fallen out of state hospital systems, people who had no permanent addresses, people whose families had given up on them, people whose employers had fired them, people who were, in the language of the social work file, of no fixed abode. They existed. There were a great many of them in the United States in 1977, and there would be a great many more after the deinstitutionalization waves of the early 80s came through. The supply, in operational terms, was adequate. Pierce stopped after he said that word, supply. He looked at me. He said, "Captain, this is the part of the briefing where some men have asked to be reassigned. The reassignment requires that you sign additional papers and that you be confined for a period of time while the program determines what to do with you. I will tell you, honestly, that to my knowledge, no man has ever been reassigned out of this program and returned to ordinary duty. I do not know what happens to the men who ask. I can guess. I have not been told. If you want to ask, this is the moment. After this moment, you will be operational, and I will not be able to help you." I did not ask. I will tell you why I did not ask. I did not ask because I had voted yes in that room on October 17th. I had voted yes when I thought the cost would be borne by someone other than me. I did not feel that I had the standing, now that I knew what the cost was, to step out of the room and ask someone else to bear it. I did not feel I had earned that. That is what I told myself. The truer thing is that I was afraid of what would happen to me if I asked. I was 29 years old. I had a wife in Nebraska. I did not want to disappear. Both things were true. The vote was true. The fear was true. They lived in me side by side, and they have lived in me side by side for the rest of my life, and I have not, at any point in 49 years, been able to fully separate them. I told Pierce I was ready to proceed. He nodded. He said, "We will begin tomorrow. I am sending you to Phoenix. Sergeant Briscoe and a recruiter named Sarah Trent will brief you on the operational architecture. You will be the case officer for the Southwest region. There are 3 regional case officers. You report to me. You answer questions from no one else, including but not limited to anyone at the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or any congressional committee or staff member, regardless of clearance level. If you are challenged by anyone outside this program, you refer the challenge to me. If you are caught in a circumstance where you cannot refer the challenge to me, you say nothing. You can be court-martialed for nothing. You cannot be court-martialed back to ordinary duty for revealing the existence of this program. You understand that distinction?" I said I did. "Good," he said. "Get some sleep, Captain. Tomorrow you are going to learn how the United States government takes people out of the population without anyone noticing." I went back to my barracks. I sat on the bed. I did not sleep. I have not slept 8 uninterrupted hours since the night of October 17th, 1977. I am putting that down for the record because it is true and because I have stopped pretending it is not. I sleep in 2-hour and 3-hour pieces. I have done so for 49 years. I have learned to live this way. I do not recommend it. The operational architecture that Briscoe and Trent walked me through in Phoenix the following week was, in its essential design, a beautiful piece of bureaucratic engineering. It was beautiful the way certain kinds of weapons are beautiful. It worked the way it was designed to work. It hid the things it was designed to hide. It generated the paperwork it was designed to generate. It was the product of careful thought by people who knew exactly what they were building. The cover entity was called Federal Reintegration Services. It was registered as an interagency program under a joint authority of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and the Department of Justice. Its stated mission was the reintegration of chronically homeless and institutionally displaced individuals into supervised residential care. It had a real budget line. It had real staff in a real office building in Bethesda. It had a real director who reported real numbers to a real congressional oversight subcommittee. It existed. What it actually did was different from what it appeared to do. The recruiters were Federal Reintegration Services caseworkers. They had badges, they had identification cards, they had business cards with their names and the program's seal. They worked out of regional offices in Phoenix, Atlanta, and Chicago. They went into state psychiatric hospitals and asked to interview patients. They went to county jails and asked to interview prisoners about to be released. They went into homeless shelters and missing persons offices and runaway intake centers. They identified candidates. They did so using the screening tools that Holloway had developed. The screening tools looked, to anyone who saw them, like standard psychiatric and social history intake forms. They asked questions about dreams. They asked questions about religious experiences. They asked questions about creative pursuits. They asked questions about the candidate's interior life, what they thought about during long quiet periods, whether they imagined other lives, whether they heard voices and what those voices were like. They asked questions that, taken together, identified the people whose neurochemistry was likely to produce metheric acid at the required concentrations. The candidates who scored above the threshold were flagged. The flagged candidates were then offered enrollment in the Federal Reintegration Services residential program. The program promised housing, meals, medical care, vocational training, and a structured environment. For people who had been sleeping under highway overpasses or eating in soup kitchens or staring at the walls of state hospital day rooms for years, the offer was generally accepted. The candidates were transported to one of 3 regional intake centers, where they were processed. The intake centers were real. They housed candidates for a screening period of 3 to 10 days. During this period, the candidates were given good food and clean clothes and medical attention and an opportunity to rest. They were not abused. They were not lied to about the immediate circumstances of their care. They were simply not told what was coming. At the end of the screening period, the candidates who had been confirmed by blood and urine testing as metheric acid positive were transferred to Lateral Site 4 for what their case files described as advanced therapeutic evaluation. The candidates who tested negative were placed in actual long-term residential care under the cover program's real charter. Those candidates received the housing and the care that had been promised. They lived out the remainder of their lives in supervised settings funded by the program. There were, by the time the program ended in 1987, several hundred such individuals in residential placement. Their care continued after the program closed. The department maintained the budget line for them quietly for many years. I want to be clear about this. The cover program saved a number of lives that would otherwise have ended in alleys and ditches. It also identified, screened, and delivered 470 other people to a chamber in the Nevada desert from which they did not return. Both of these things are true. I have not been able to weigh them against each other on any scale I can trust. I do not think anyone can. The painful part, the part that I will tell you about now, because I have to, and because it has been the thing in my head most often for 30 years, is the part that I did not understand until year 3. The screening tests we used to identify metheric acid producers had been based on Holloway's correlation work in the first 3 months of the program. Holloway had tested the indirect markers in cadaver samples and in postmortem brain tissue against the questions on the screening form, and he had calibrated the form to predict the chemistry with reasonable accuracy. The form worked. It identified candidates with high probability of being positive on the actual blood test. What Holloway did not tell me until much later, and what I figured out partially on my own before he confirmed it, was that the questions on the form did not just identify the chemistry, they also identified the people. The questions about dreams identified people who dreamed vividly and remembered their dreams. The questions about voices identified people who heard voices. The questions about other lives identified people who built rich fantasy worlds and lived partly in them. The questions about religious experiences identified people who had felt the presence of the holy and could not always tell others about it without being thought strange. The questions about creative pursuits identified people who had been writers and artists and musicians, often without formal recognition, often having retreated from formal recognition into private practice. These were, in the population of vagrants and transients and institutionalized people that we were drawing from, the same people, the schizophrenics, the mystics. the artists who had fallen through the system, the dreamers who had been pushed out of their homes, the children of God who had been told they were sick, the people who, for whatever combination of neurochemistry and circumstance, had been seeing too much and feeling too much and imagining too much, and who had been driven by the world around them or by the limitations of their own minds, or by both, to the margins. The very thing in them that had marked them as different was the thing the entities wanted. The very chemistry that had ruined their lives was the chemistry that made them valuable. The system had not been calibrated to harvest the marginal. The marginal had been produced, in part, by the absence of any framework for valuing what they could do. We had built the harvest by inheriting the categories that the world had already created. We did not need to invent a new way to identify them. The world had already identified them and pushed them out, and we were collecting them where they fell. I figured this out one night in February of 1980, sitting in my office in Phoenix with a file open in front of me, looking at the intake notes on a man we had picked up at a homeless shelter in Tucson. The intake notes said that he had been a working sculptor in San Diego in the early 70s. He had lost a contract. He had started drinking. His wife had left him. He had started hearing his sister's voice in empty rooms. His sister had been dead since 1960. He had been picked up by the police twice for vagrancy. He had spent 11 months in a state hospital. He had been released to a halfway house. He had walked out of the halfway house. He had been sleeping in a city park for 6 months when our recruiter found him. His metheric acid concentration was the highest we had measured to that point. He was scheduled for transfer to lateral site 4 the following Monday. I sat with that file for a long time. I had a bottle of Old Crow in my desk drawer that night. I drank a great deal of it. I did not finish reading the file. I went home eventually and slept for 2 hours, and came back to the office at 5 in the morning and processed the transfer paperwork. The man was delivered to the chamber on a Tuesday in late February. He walked across the threshold while Reverend Doss read from the 23rd Psalm. I was not present for the handover. I was in Phoenix. I did not need to be present. I had done my part already. I have thought about that man more often than I have thought about my own father. I do not know if that is a confession or a sentence. I have decided over the years that it does not matter which. The first donation was a young man named Thomas Mercer. I was not the case officer who recruited him. He was picked up by the Atlanta regional team out of a state hospital in Arizona, where he had been institutionalized for what the records called florid schizophrenia of recent onset. He was 22 years old. He was from a small town outside Flagstaff. He had no living family. His mother had died of cancer when he was 15. His father had been killed in a car accident 2 years later. He had been raised by an aunt in his late teens. The aunt had died of a stroke in 1976. By the time he came to the attention of the state hospital, he was sleeping in the breezeways of strip malls in Phoenix and being moved along by mall security on a regular basis. He had been institutionalized after a Sunday morning in which he had walked into the sanctuary of a Methodist church during services and stood in the center aisle and told the congregation that he could see the angels at the corners of the room and that the angels were singing. He had told the congregation that the angels were singing in a language that was older than human language. He had told the congregation that he was being asked to leave with the angels and that he was afraid to leave and that he was also afraid to stay. He had then sat down in the front pew and put his head in his hands and cried for 40 minutes. The minister had called the police. The police had brought him to the hospital. He had been there for 9 weeks when our recruiter, a woman named Linda Cole, walked in on a Wednesday in late November and asked the chief of staff to let her review the patient roster. Linda Cole identified Thomas Mercer in her first afternoon of file review. She flagged him for screening. The screening confirmed his chemistry. He was transferred to lateral site 4 on December 2nd, 1977. I met him because Pierce wanted me to. Pierce had decided, I think, that I needed to see the operation from end to end at least once, and that I needed to see it for the first donation. He told me in the briefing on December 1st that I would be present for Mercer's handover. He told me this in the same tone he used for any other operational order. I traveled from Phoenix to Lateral Site 4 that morning. I arrived in the afternoon. I went to the holding building, which was a small concrete structure at the east end of the compound where subjects were housed for the 3 days before handover. The holding building had 4 rooms. Each room had a bed and a small writing desk and a single window that looked out on the mountains. Each room had a small bookshelf with a selection of books that Holloway had chosen personally. Holloway had thought about the books for a long time. He had chosen them to be calming. The shelf in Mercer's room held a Bible, a paperback Norton Anthology of English Literature, a volume of Robert Frost's poems, a Louis L'Amour Western called Hondo, and a children's book called The Velveteen Rabbit that Holloway said he had included in every room because he believed people deserved to have it near them at the end. I do not know if Mercer read it. I went to Mercer's room. I sat with him for 40 minutes. He was a thin young man with light brown hair that needed cutting and gentle brown eyes, and the kind of soft mouth that some young men have when they have not yet learned to set their faces against the world. He was wearing the clean denim pants and the cotton work shirt that the holding building issued. He was sitting on the edge of his bed when I came in. He stood up. He shook my hand. He thanked me for coming to see him. He thanked me. I asked him how he was being treated. Real good, he said. The food is the best I have had in a long time. Dr. Holloway came and saw me yesterday. He is a kind man. He explained that there is going to be a procedure tomorrow, and that I might be afraid, but that I should not be. He said the procedure is to find out if I can help with something important. I asked him if he had any questions for me. He thought about it for a while. I have not been outside in a long time, he said. Could somebody walk me out tomorrow morning before the procedure? I would like to see the sun come up. I have not seen it from a quiet place in a long time. I told him I would arrange it. I arranged it. I asked Briscoe to walk him out at 6 the next morning. Briscoe did it. He walked Mercer out to the eastern fence of the compound, and they stood there together and watched the sun come up over the Pintwater Range. Briscoe told me later that Mercer had not spoken during the walk. He had simply watched. When the sun was fully up, he had turned to Briscoe and said, "Thank you," and they had walked back to the holding building. Briscoe was not the kind of man who told me things like that. He told me this one. The handover was scheduled for 10:30 that morning. The protocol had been worked out over the preceding weeks. The chaplain met the subject at the door of the holding building. The chaplain walked the subject across the compound to the descent shaft. The chaplain accompanied the subject down the staircase. The chaplain accompanied the subject into the chamber. The chaplain read from the 23rd Psalm. The subject walked from the chaplain to the threshold. The subject crossed the threshold. The chaplain left the chamber. The chamber was sealed. The aperture was monitored. Reverend Doss met Thomas Mercer at the door of the holding building at 10:15. Mercer was calm. He had eaten a small breakfast. He had washed his face. He was wearing the same denim pants and cotton shirt. He shook Doss's hand. He thanked Doss for coming. He thanked Doss the way he had thanked me. He had been raised, somewhere along the line, to be polite. He carried it with him into a morning that did not deserve his politeness. They walked across the compound together. I followed at a distance of about 30 feet, with Pierce and Holloway. We did not speak. Vance was in the monitoring booth below. Riley was in the chamber. Briscoe was at the top of the descent shaft, holding the security door open. The 4 of us went down the staircase. Mercer walked between Doss and the wall. He did not touch the wall. He kept his hand a few inches away from it, the way a child does when they are not allowed to touch something. He looked up once at the bulb on the second landing. He looked at it for a moment. He looked away. We came into the chamber. Riley was standing near the monitoring booth window with his headphones on and his clipboard in his hand. The aperture was where it had always been, in the center of the room. The chamber was very quiet. The instruments in the booth were running. I could hear the tape recorders. I could hear the small mechanical sigh of the oscillograph drawing its line. Doss took Mercer to a point about 10 feet from the aperture. He turned Mercer to face him. He put his hand on Mercer's shoulder. He spoke quietly. He said the words of the 23rd Psalm, the King James Version. He said them slowly. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Mercer listened. He had his eyes closed. When Doss finished, Mercer opened his eyes. He nodded once. He looked at Doss. He looked at the aperture. He looked back at Doss. He said, "Is it going to hurt?" Doss said, "I do not know, son. I am sorry. I do not know." Mercer nodded again. He squared his shoulders. He turned toward the aperture. He walked toward it. He took 5 steps. He stopped at the threshold. He stood there for what I would estimate at 4 seconds. He did not look back at us. He did not say anything more. He raised his right hand and put it forward, the way a man puts his hand into deep water to test the temperature. His hand entered the aperture. I want to tell you what I saw next. I want to be specific. I owe Thomas Mercer specificity. I will give it to you as best I can. His hand entered the aperture, and the geometry of his hand was not preserved across the threshold. I do not mean that it was distorted. I mean that there was a relationship between the part of his hand still on our side and the part of his hand on the other side that did not match any spatial relationship I had ever seen. His hand was in 2 configurations at once. The configuration on our side was a hand. The configuration on the other side was a hand also, but it was a hand in a different orientation, and the orientation on the other side did not correspond to anything his wrist could have done. The 2 configurations were connected at the threshold. The connection looked for a moment like a hinge. He stepped through. The geometry of his body did to his body what the geometry of his hand had done to his hand. He was in 2 configurations. The configurations were connected. They were not configurations that matched the body of a single person. They were the body of a person in 2 places at once, and the 2 places were not the same kind of place. He was, I want to say, taken. He was taken across the threshold. He was not crossing it. Something on the other side was receiving him. He was being received, the way mail is received, the way a hand reaches into a mailbox and takes out a letter. His body was the letter. There was a sound. The sound was the one I described before. The sound like a wet rope under tension. The rope held for about 2 seconds. The rope released. The aperture was empty. Thomas Mercer was no longer in the chamber. He was no longer in our universe in any sense that I could describe. I knew that immediately and with absolute certainty, in a way that has never wavered in 49 years. He was not dead. He was somewhere. He was at some level of the layered reality that I do not understand, and that I do not believe Vance fully understood either, still being processed across that threshold in some state that I cannot name. We waited. We waited for 3 hours. We sat in the chamber. Doss sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his eyes closed. Pierce stood near the booth window with his hands behind his back. Holloway stood next to me. Riley stayed near his monitoring station with his headphones on. At 13:47, Riley raised his hand. He listened. He wrote one word on his clipboard. He showed it to Pierce. The word was received. Pierce nodded. We left the chamber. We climbed the staircase. Briscoe closed the security door. The aperture was monitored continuously for the next 6 days. There was no further communication. The donation had been accepted. The first delivery of the agreement had been completed. That night, in my barracks room, I wrote a letter to Joan. I did not send it. I burned it in the small metal trash can by the bed. I did not write to her again for 3 months. When I finally did write, I did not mention what I had seen. I never mentioned, in any letter I wrote to her in the 4 years that remained of her life, anything about what I was doing. She believed I was working a desk job. She believed it because I wanted her to. She died believing it. That was a small mercy that I gave her. It was the only mercy I had to give. The first year settled into a rhythm faster than I would have believed possible. That is what shocked me most about the early period. We were doing something that we all understood, on some level, to be monstrous, and within 4 months we had a routine. We had operational templates. We had budget reviews. We had a recruitment quota tracking system that Briscoe had built using a green hardcover ledger he kept in his office safe. We had a transport schedule. We had a chaplain rotation when Doss needed rest, which Doss took only twice in the entire 10 years. We had a screening pipeline that processed roughly 4 times as many candidates as we actually delivered, because the false positive rate on the indirect markers was higher than Holloway had initially estimated. We had a quiet, professional, fully functional pipeline that converted human beings into deliveries. Routines protect you. That is the secret nobody tells you about doing terrible work. The routine becomes a kind of container. You stop thinking about what is in the container and you start thinking about whether the container is being processed correctly. You start to take pride in the smoothness of the processing. You start to notice when the processing has a hitch in it, and you fix the hitch and you feel the small satisfaction of having fixed it. And the satisfaction is the same satisfaction you would feel fixing a leaky faucet at home. The satisfaction is the same regardless of what the routine is. I want to be honest about this. I felt that satisfaction. I felt it in the 3rd month and the 4th and the 5th. I would close a quarterly recruitment report at my desk in Phoenix and lean back in my chair and feel that small, satisfied feeling of a job done correctly. I would catch myself feeling it. I would put my hands flat on my desk. I would sit with the feeling for a moment and try to make myself disgusted by it. The disgust would come. The satisfaction would come back. They sat in me together the way the vote and the fear had sat together, and I worked. By the end of the first year, we had delivered 47 subjects. The first was Thomas Mercer. The 47th was a woman named Marcella Bowen, a former piano teacher from St. Louis who had been institutionalized after the death of her son in 1974 and who had spent 2 years in a state facility in Missouri before being released to a halfway house, and from there to a transient lifestyle in the western states. Holloway had been her medical screener. He told me, in a quiet conversation in the mess hall the week after her handover, that she had played a piano for him in the visitors' lounge of the holding building on the 2nd night of her stay. The lounge had an old upright piano that had been there when the department took possession of the site. Nobody had ever played it. The strings were out of tune. Marcella had sat down at it and played, from memory, the 2nd movement of Beethoven's Sonata in E-flat, Opus 7. She had played it through twice. She had then closed the piano. She had told Holloway thank you. She had gone back to her room. Holloway had her file open in front of him in the mess hall when he told me this. He closed the file. He put it on the table. He took out his small green notebook. He wrote something in it. He did not show me what he wrote. He looked at me. He said, "Captain, I am keeping a record. I want you to know that if anything happens to me, I want at least one other person to know that the record exists." I asked him where the record was. "Phoenix," he said. "A safe deposit box at the First Western Bank on Camelback Road, box 317. The key is taped to the underside of the 3rd drawer of my desk in the medical office. The signature card lists my brother and one other person. I would like to add you as the other person. May I?" I told him he could. He added me to the signature card the following Monday. The record lived in that box for the next 21 years. When Holloway died in February of 1998 of a heart attack in a hotel room in Albuquerque, the box and its contents came to me. I have read the notebooks. There were 11 of them by the end. They are still in my possession. I have not shown them to anyone living. I will not, while I am alive, decide what to do with them. I have left instructions in my own papers. The Tucson incident happened in March of 1980. It was the closest the program came in the entire 10 years to being exposed. Um, the recruiter involved was Sarah Trent. She had been with us since the start of the second year. She was 31, originally from Salt Lake City, divorced, no children. She had come out of a social work career and had been recruited into the program through a Department of Health, Education, and Welfare placement. She had the temperament for the work, which is to say that she could do it without breaking, but she did not, like some of the recruiters who came after her, take any pleasure in it. She did the job. She did not enjoy the job. She drank too much in the evenings and slept badly and got up in the morning and did the job again. I trusted her more than I trusted most of the other regional recruiters because of this. The ones who developed a taste for it did not last. They either broke harder than the rest of us at some point, or they began to make mistakes that drew attention, or they had to be removed from the field for reasons that were never put in writing. Trent picked up a man at the Greyhound terminal in downtown Tucson on the afternoon of March 11th, 1980. His name was Earl Cobb. He was 47 years old. He was wearing a Korean War-era field jacket and carrying a duffel bag. He had been sleeping in the terminal for 3 nights. Trent had been working a sweep of the terminal that week with 2 other recruiters. She had identified Cobb on the second day from the way he was reading a paperback copy of Walden in the waiting area. She had approached him on the 3rd day and conducted a screening interview in the terminal's coffee shop. He had scored well above threshold. She had offered him enrollment. He had accepted. She had transported him to the Phoenix Intake Center that same afternoon. What Trent had not done, and what was not on the standard recruitment protocol because the recruiters were not required to do it, was a full sweep of the candidate's local contacts before pickup. The protocol assumed that vagrants and transients did not have meaningful local contacts. The protocol was correct most of the time. It was not correct in the case of Earl Cobb. Cobb had a younger sister in Tucson. Her name was Ruth Cobb. She was 44 years old. She lived in a small house on the east side of the city with her husband, who was a foreman at a construction company. She had not seen her brother in 8 years. She had thought he was dead. She had been informed 2 months earlier, through a chain of acquaintances that had taken nearly a year to deliver the message, that her brother had been seen alive in the Phoenix area, and that he was traveling between there and Tucson and Las Vegas, sleeping rough and occasionally working day labor jobs. She had been trying to find him ever since. She had filed missing persons reports with the Tucson Police Department, the Phoenix Police Department, the Pima County Sheriff's Office, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She had hired a private investigator. The investigator had been making slow progress. On March 14th, 3 days after Trent's pickup, the investigator located the witness who had last seen Earl Cobb in Tucson. The witness reported that Cobb had been approached at the Greyhound terminal by a woman in a Federal Reintegration Services uniform and had left with her voluntarily. Ruth Cobb went to the Pima County Sheriff's Office. She spoke with a deputy named Frank Mendez. Mendez looked up Federal Reintegration Services in his desk reference. He found the cover entity. He called the Bethesda office. The Bethesda office told him that yes, the program had recently enrolled a client matching her brother's description, and that the client was in the program's residential care, and that contact with family was not permitted during the initial stabilization period, which was typically 4 to 6 weeks. The Bethesda office offered to take Ruth Cobb's contact information and pass it along to the case manager for follow-up at the end of the stabilization period. Ruth Cobb did not accept this answer. She drove home. She called her congressman's office. The congressman's office told her they would look into it. The congressman's office called Federal Reintegration Services and was told the same thing the deputy had been told. The congressman's office relayed the information to Ruth Cobb. Ruth Cobb did not accept this answer either. She drove back to the sheriff's office. She asked to speak with a senior detective. She was directed to a sheriff's sergeant named Dale Cantrell. Cantrell was 49 years old, 23 years on the job, a quiet, competent investigator with a reputation for following paper trails. He listened to Ruth Cobb's story. He took notes. He told her he would look into it. He looked into it. He started with the cover entity's tax filings. He filed an open records request with the Internal Revenue Service. He cross-referenced the program's listed residential facilities against state licensing records. He found that 2 of the 3 listed facilities did not appear in any state long-term care licensing database. He called both facilities. He got generic answering services. He drove to the address of the closer facility, which was listed in Mesa, Arizona. He found a small office building. He found that the office on the listed floor was occupied by a Federal Reintegration Services regional office that was real, that had real staff, and that had no residential beds on the premises. He asked the regional office where the actual residential facilities were located. He was told the information was protected for client confidentiality reasons. He asked under what statute. He was told the statute reference would be provided in writing within 10 business days. He did not wait 10 business days. He went to the Mesa office's parking lot. He recorded the license plates of all vehicles parked there. He ran the plates. He found 1 plate registered to a Department of Energy vehicle pool. He filed a follow-up records request with the Department of Energy. He asked why a Department of Energy vehicle was parked at a Department of Health and Human Services contractor's office. The records request triggered a flag in a system at the Department of Energy that nobody at Cantrell's level was supposed to know existed. The flag came to Pierce's desk on the morning of March 27th. Pierce read the flag report. He called me into his office at 11 that morning. He told me what was happening. He told me what we were going to do about it. What we did about it was the following. The Federal Bureau of Investigation special agent in charge of the Phoenix field office was a man named Curtis Halloway. No relation to our medical lead. Curtis Halloway had a working relationship with our program through a back channel that had been built specifically for the purpose of handling situations like this. Pierce called Halloway that afternoon. Halloway sent 2 of his agents to Tucson the following morning. The agents met with Sergeant Cantrell at his office. The agents told Cantrell that he had stumbled into an active federal national security investigation. They told him that his inquiries were creating operational complications. They told him that the matter was now being handled at a level above his clearance, and that he was being formally instructed to close his open file on Earl Cobb, to refer Ruth Cobb to a victim services contact they would provide, and to refrain from any further inquiry into Federal Reintegration Services or its associated entities. They told him, additionally, that his service record had been reviewed and that he was a candidate for a federal task force position that was being constituted to address violent crime on Indian reservations in the Southwest. The position carried a substantial pay increase and a relocation allowance to Albuquerque. They told him that the offer would expire in 72 hours. Cantrell asked the agents what would happen if he refused the offer and continued his investigation. The agents told him, in language that was carefully chosen, that he would be unable to find further information regarding Earl Cobb or Federal Reintegration Services through any channel available to him, and that continued public inquiry on his part would be regarded as a federal national security matter, with consequences that they were not authorized to fully describe to him. They left him with a card. They told him to call within 72 hours. Cantrell took the position. He moved to Albuquerque in May of 1980. He worked the federal task force for the remainder of his career. He retired in 1989 at the rank of Senior Special Investigator. He died of liver cancer in 1993. I do not know what he thought about it in the years between. I have wondered specifically whether he ever looked at his own face in the bathroom mirror in the morning and saw what I see when I look at mine. I do not know. Ruth Cobb was assigned to a victim services contact, a woman with our program, who told her on April 15th, 1980, that her brother had died in a fire at a Federal Reintegration Services residential facility in eastern Arizona, that the fire had been an electrical accident, and that her brother's remains had been too badly damaged to permit identification or return for burial. She was given a death certificate. She was given a settlement check for $18,000 from the program's insurance carrier. She was asked to sign a release of all further claims against the federal government. She signed it. She was given a small wooden box that was said to contain the ashes of remains recovered from the fire site. The ashes in the box were not her brother's. They were her brother's. They were not the ashes of any single person. They were a composite of cremated tissue from a medical school in Tucson that the program maintained a quiet arrangement with. The box was something. The ceremony of presentation was something. Ruth Cobb received it with both hands and wept. I was the one who signed the paperwork to release the settlement check. My signature is on it. My name is on it. I signed it on April 14th, 1980, in my office in Phoenix. I signed it with a black government-issue ballpoint pen. I put the pen back in the cup on my desk after I signed. The cup held 3 other pens like it. I noticed that the cup was full. I noticed that I should clean out the cup. I made a note to do it later. I did not do it later. The pen stayed in the cup for the next 7 years. Major Harold Vinson joined Project Threshold in the spring of 1980. He was a 43-year-old career intelligence officer who had been brought in as Pierce's deputy and as the program's chief administrative officer. He was responsible for, among other things, the production of the death certificates and the cover documentation that went out to the families of subjects whose existing personal records required closure. He built the pipeline that would, across the program's full 10 years, produce 471 such documents. The 471st was for a man who was a false positive on the chemistry test and whose existing records had been closed prematurely. We had to maintain the closure to preserve the cover. The man had no living family. He lived out his life under a different name at a residential facility in southern Arizona. He died there in 1991. Vinson had signed his original death certificate in 1981, the year of the false positive, during his tenure with us. Vinson was a thin, tall man with a long face and pale eyes, and the kind of careful handwriting that you used to see on engineering drawings. He had been raised in a small town in eastern Tennessee. His father had been a Methodist minister. His mother had been a schoolteacher. He had 3 brothers, all of whom were also in some branch of the federal government. He had a wife named Patricia and 2 daughters, one in college and one in high school. The college daughter was at Vanderbilt. The high school daughter was thinking about applying to Wellesley. He kept a small framed photograph of both of them on his desk. He kept a second framed photograph in the top drawer. It was a photograph of his mother as a young woman, taken in a garden in 1934. He took it out to look at it sometimes. He did not show it to other people. I saw it once because I came into his office without knocking, which I would not have done if I had known. Vinson was good at the work. He had a head for paperwork. He could produce a believable death certificate in 11 minutes. He had a system for selecting plausible causes of death that varied by region and by the deceased's prior medical history, so that no pattern would emerge if anyone ever looked. He produced and filed the documentation. He drafted the cover correspondence to families. He coordinated the maintenance of the cover entity's regulatory filings. He was, by the 2nd year of his tenure, the operational backbone of the program's administrative concealment. None of the work would have functioned without him. He took his own life on a Sunday night in October of 1982. He was in his quarters at the facility. He used his service sidearm. He went to the bathroom of his quarters before he did it, presumably because he did not want to ruin the carpet. He left no note. He had set out on the desk in his quarters the small framed photograph of his mother. The photograph was the only thing on the desk. His other personal effects had been packed into a single duffel bag that was set neatly on the bed. Briscoe found him at 6 the next morning. Briscoe came and got me. I went to the quarters. I stood in the doorway. I did not go in. Holloway came in past me with his medical bag. Doss arrived a few minutes later. Pierce arrived shortly after that. We stood in the hallway outside the quarters for a long time. Pierce said, "Finally, I will write the family. I will tell them it was a stroke. He had been complaining of headaches. We will say it was a stroke." Doss said, "He had not been complaining of headaches." "He had been complaining of headaches," Pierce said. Doss did not argue. The funeral was held the following Friday at a small chapel at Andrews Air Force Base. I flew out for it. The widow, Patricia, received the folded flag with great dignity. The college daughter cried quietly. The high school daughter did not cry at all. She held her mother's hand. She was, that day, 15 years old. She had her father's pale eyes. I do not know what became of her. I have sometimes wondered if she works in some agency now and whether her father's case file is something she has been cleared to read. I hope not. I hope she became a music teacher or a veterinarian or something quiet in a quiet town, and that she had children, and that her children are the kind of people who do not look for things in the dark. Reverend Doss did not speak at the funeral. He had been asked to. He had declined. He had told Pierce, the day before the funeral, that he was going to stop talking. He had told Pierce that he had decided this on Tuesday morning, and that he had spent the days since trying to decide whether he could continue his other duties under the constraint. He had told Pierce that he could continue, but that he would not speak. He would walk subjects. He would read scripture, written out on a card that he would hand to the subject before they entered the chamber. He would not, after the funeral of Major Vincent, speak any further word aloud. Pierce had asked him why. Doss had told him. Pierce had told me, 2 weeks later, in the empty mess hall at 11 at night, what Doss had said. Doss had said that he had been counting the words he had spoken in the chamber, and that he was up to a certain number, and that he had decided that he did not want any more of his words attached to that place. He had said that he had decided this watching the photograph of Vincent's mother on Vincent's desk on the morning the body was found. He had said that he had thought, looking at the photograph, that Vincent had laid out his mother's picture as a way of saying goodbye to her without using any words, and that he, Doss, had understood for the first time in his career as a chaplain that there were times when the words were the problem. He kept his vow. He never spoke another word in my hearing. He stayed on with the program for the remaining 5 years. He walked subjects. He read scripture from his cards. He communicated by writing on a small notepad that he carried in his breast pocket. He ate his meals in the mess hall with the rest of us. He nodded to us when we sat down. He did not speak. I went to see him in the hospital in Charleston, South Carolina, in March of 1991. He was dying of an aggressive cancer of the throat that I believe to this day was the price of the vow. He was 74 years old. He was in a private room at the Veterans Administration Hospital. He had no living family. He had asked the hospital, when he was admitted, that he be allowed certain visitors if they came. I was one of those visitors. He could not speak even if he had wanted to. The cancer had taken most of his throat. He had a small chalkboard on the bedside table. He wrote on it with a piece of chalk. He wrote, when I came in, the words, "Thank you for coming." I sat with him for 2 hours. I told him about my life. I told him that Joan had been gone 10 years. I told him that I had retired the year before. I told him that I drove out to a high point above the old site every October and watched the sky. I told him I did not know why. He wrote on his chalkboard, "Yes, you do." I told him I supposed I did. He wrote on his chalkboard, "They will come back." I asked him how he knew. He wrote on his chalkboard, "I have heard them in my sleep." I did not ask him to clarify. I did not want to know what he meant. I sat with him for another half hour without speaking. He closed his eyes. I thought he was sleeping. He was not. He opened his eyes when I stood to leave. He wrote on his chalkboard, with hands that were shaking very badly by then, "Forgive yourself if you can. I have not been able to." He died 9 days later. I did not go to the funeral. I have regretted it. I have regretted many things. The near escape happened in June of 1984. It was the only time in 10 years of operation that a subject came close to getting away. The subject was a man named Russell Pike. He was 40 years old, originally from Albuquerque, a former roofer who had been disabled by a fall in 1979 and had spent the years since drifting between Albuquerque and Las Cruces and El Paso, sleeping in shelters and day labor halls and once in a small camp under a highway overpass north of Las Cruces, where he had been picked up by a recruiter in May. His chemistry was strong. His screening interview had revealed that he was an unpublished poet who had been writing in a series of notebooks for 15 years, and that he carried the most recent notebook with him in a plastic bag wrapped in a torn piece of canvas. He had refused to be separated from the notebook during intake. Holloway had personally signed off on allowing him to keep it in the holding building. Pike had spent his 3 days in the holding building, writing in the notebook for many hours each day. He had filled it nearly to the back cover. The handover was scheduled for 10 in the morning on June 14th. What happened was that Pike, who had given no prior indication of resistance, broke from Reverend Doss in the courtyard between the holding building and the descent shaft. He had been walking calmly. He had reached a point about 40 feet from the shaft entrance when he turned and ran. He ran south. He cleared the inner security fence by climbing it at a low point near the maintenance shed. He cleared the outer perimeter fence the same way, with a 30-second delay during which Briscoe, who was running about 100 feet behind him, almost caught up. He cleared the perimeter at 10:04. He was in the open desert. I was at the facility that day because I was due to fly back to Phoenix that afternoon and had wanted to be present for the handover. I was at the administrative building when the alarm sounded. I went out into the courtyard. I saw Briscoe going over the perimeter fence. I saw the security personnel mobilizing. Pierce was already moving toward the operations vehicle. I went with him. We caught Pike 3/4 of a mile out in a shallow arroyo to the south of the facility, hiding behind a creosote bush. Briscoe and 2 security men reached him first. Pierce and I arrived a minute later in the truck. Pike was breathing hard. He had cut his hands on the perimeter fence. He had lost his hat. His notebook had fallen out of the plastic bag at some point during the run, and he had not stopped to retrieve it. The notebook would later be found about a 1/4 mile back along his path by one of the search team. Briscoe brought it to me that night. I have it still. Pike did not fight when Briscoe and the security men put their hands on him. He sat down in the dirt and put his head on his knees and breathed. He looked up when Pierce got out of the truck. He looked at Pierce. He looked at me. He looked at the security men. He said, "I wrote a poem this morning. I wrote it before breakfast. I thought it was the best one I had ever written. I thought maybe I should not let it go. That is why I ran. I am sorry." Pierce did not respond to him. Pierce was looking back at the facility. Pierce was looking at the radio in the truck. The radio was making a sound it did not normally make. It was making a low buzzing sound with intermittent pulses. Pierce reached into the truck and turned the radio up. The buzzing was the resonance. The resonance was reaching us 3/4 of a mile from the chamber, audible through the truck radio. It had not done this before. It had never been detectable outside the chamber. Pierce got on the radio to the facility. He raised Vance in the monitoring booth. Vance's voice was unsteady. The aperture, she said, had begun to widen at 10:05. The widening had accelerated at 10:09, which was approximately the moment Briscoe had cleared the outer perimeter fence in pursuit. The widening had stabilized at 10:12, which was approximately the moment the security team had put their hands on Pike. The aperture was now about 30% larger than baseline. It was holding at the new size. Riley was at the monitoring station. Riley was hearing speech. Pierce asked what the speech was saying. Vance, on the radio, said, "Riley is on the other line. I am going to put him through." Riley came on the radio. His voice was very calm. "Colonel," he said, "they are saying the same phrase repeating. The agreement requires only complete delivery. They are saying this phrase in 3 different cadences. They are saying it the way someone would explain a rule to a child. They are also generating behind the verbal speech a tone pattern I have not heard before. The tone pattern, I believe, is the substrate of the wider entry. I think they are showing us what the unbinding would sound like." Pierce asked Riley whether he believed the unbinding would proceed if we did not deliver Pike within a specific time frame. Riley said, "I believe so, sir. I cannot give you a duration. I think we have minutes, not hours." Pierce told him to stand by. Pierce turned to Briscoe. He said, "Get him in the truck." Briscoe and the security men got Pike into the back of the truck. Pierce drove us back to the facility. The drive took 6 minutes. The resonance on the truck radio grew slowly louder during the drive. When we reached the perimeter, Pierce stopped the truck. He looked at me. He said, "Captain, I am going to ask you to walk Pike to the chamber. Doss is in no condition. I need a senior officer to be present at the threshold. I need it to be you. I am giving you a direct order. Do you understand?" I told him I understood. I walked Russell Pike to the chamber. He did not resist. He walked beside me. He had stopped speaking. The blood from his hands had dried into the cuffs of his sleeves. We went down the staircase together. The resonance was very loud in the descent shaft. I could feel it in my teeth. I could feel it in the bones of my forearms. We came into the chamber. Riley was at the monitoring station with his headphones on. The aperture was significantly larger than I had seen it. It looked, that morning, like a doorway in something. It looked like an actual doorway. I took Russell Pike to the threshold. I did not have a card from Doss. I had not thought to ask for one. I did not know any scripture by heart that seemed adequate. I stood next to Pike at a distance of about 10 feet from the aperture, and I tried to think of what to say to him. He looked at me. He said, "It is all right, Captain. You do not have to say anything. I am ready. I just want to ask you something first." I told him to ask. He said, "Did you read the poem?" "In the notebook. There is a poem on the second to last page that I wrote on Tuesday night. It is called The Last Good Light. I would like someone to read it. I would like it if that person was you. Would you read it?" I told him I would. He nodded. He looked at the aperture. He walked toward it. He did not stop at the threshold. He walked through. The sound was the wet rope sound, but it was louder. It held for about 3 seconds instead of 2. It released. The aperture began to contract immediately. It returned to baseline size within 12 minutes. The resonance on the equipment quieted. Riley took off his headphones. He sat down on the floor of the chamber with his back against the wall and put his head in his hands. I went over to him. I crouched next to him. I put my hand on his shoulder. He was shaking very badly. I stayed there for a long time. I read the poem that night. I sat in my barracks room with Pike's notebook open on my lap, and I read every poem in it, in order, beginning at the front. The poems were about Albuquerque. They were about his sister. They were about a woman he had loved in 1967 who had married someone else. They were about working on a roof in the summer with the sun coming over the Sandias in the morning. They were about a dog he had owned as a child. They were about the smell of creosote after rain. The second to last poem was called The Last Good Light. It was about an afternoon in October, in a house that was no longer his, watching the light come through a window onto a wooden floor. It was 22 lines long. It rhymed in a pattern that I had never seen in a poem before. It was very good. It was the best poem in the notebook. I read it twice. I closed the notebook. I put it on the nightstand. I lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling. I understood that night what Doss had told Pierce after Vincent died. The boundary that protected us was not a wall. It was a courtesy. The entities could end the courtesy at any moment of their choosing. They had shown us what the ending would sound like. They had shown us the tone pattern of the unbinding. They had let us see, with the aperture at 30% above baseline, what it would look like if they decided to come through in numbers. I understood, lying on that bed, that the program was no longer a negotiation. The program had not been a negotiation since the first day. It had been a probation. We had been on probation for 4 years, and we would be on probation for 6 more, and at the end of the 6 more we would still be on probation, because the agreement said, depending upon their findings, they might be back. The probation never ended. The probation extended into the next century. The probation, I understood, lying on that bed, would outlast me and my children if I had children, and my children's children if my children had children. There was no exit. I did not sleep that night. I read the poem a third time at 3 in the morning. I have read it many times since. I have it in my files. I have left instructions about it. I have not been able to memorize it. I have tried. I cannot hold it in my head. It is the only poem I have ever tried to memorize and failed. I think about that sometimes. The years between the Pike incident and the closure ran together in a way I have never been able to fully separate in memory. I can give you the operational facts. I can give you the major incidents. The texture of life in those last 3 years is harder. We were all of us by then doing the work the way a man who has been doing carpentry for 40 years does carpentry. The hands knew. The mind drifted. The years moved. Dr. Vance began drinking openly in the summer of 1984. She had always drunk in private, by which I mean she had always kept a bottle in her desk and another in her quarters, and she had always limited herself to evenings. After Pike, she began to drink during the working day. She would have a glass of bourbon on her desk during morning briefings. She would refill it. Nobody told her not to. She continued to do her work. She was the only person on the team who understood the physics of what we were holding back, and Pierce had concluded that her work was more important than her sobriety, and that her sobriety had passed beyond the reach of any intervention available to us. She drank wild turkey. She bought it by the case through a private channel. Briscoe arranged the deliveries. He delivered 3 cases to her quarters in the summer of 1985. I helped him carry them in. She thanked us both. She gave us each a small glass of bourbon from a freshly opened bottle. We drank with her standing in her kitchen. She did not say anything during the drink. She put the empty glasses in her sink afterward. She let us out. Dr. Holloway developed a stutter in the spring of 1985. It began on certain consonants. It became more general by the end of the year. By 1986, he was speaking in shorter sentences with longer pauses, and he had begun to take notes on small index cards before speaking in any meeting so that he could read from the cards rather than speak extemporaneously. He continued to do his medical work. He continued to keep his notebooks. He continued to walk into the holding building 3 days before every delivery and sit with the subject and choose books for the shelf and adjust the dietary arrangements and ensure that the subject was treated with care. He never failed in any part of his duties. He simply, over time, became a quieter and quieter man, until he was a man who said almost nothing aloud, and who wrote everything he needed to write in the small green notebooks, and who looked, in his last year on the program, like a man who was finishing a long letter that nobody else would ever read. Lieutenant Riley's tremor became severe enough by 1986 that he could no longer write legibly on his clipboard. He shifted to a small portable cassette recorder, on which he dictated his translations in a quiet, steady voice. The contrast between the steadiness of his voice and the violence of his hands was something I noticed often in those last years. His voice was the most controlled instrument on the team. His body had become something else. He was, at this point, 33 years old. He had been with the program for 9 years. He had spent more time in proximity to the aperture than anyone alive. He was the only person who understood what the entities were saying. The work he was doing could not be reassigned. He could not be rotated out. He knew this. He had stopped, by the last year, asking to be relieved. He came to the chamber when called. He listened. He dictated. He went back to his quarters and drank tea and read paperback novels and slept in 2-hour pieces, like me. We sometimes met in the mess hall at 2 in the morning and sat together drinking tea and not speaking. There was a particular companionship in those nights. I am grateful for them. Reverend Doss continued his vow of silence. He wrote, when necessary, on his small notepad. He walked subjects. He read scripture from his cards. He sat in the mess hall at meals. He nodded to people. He prayed in his quarters at 6 in the morning every day. Briscoe, who walked the perimeter at that hour, told me that he sometimes heard Doss praying through the window. He told me he could not make out the words, but that the cadence was wrong. He told me, the one time he raised it, that he thought Doss was praying in a language Briscoe did not recognize. He had grown up Methodist in Oklahoma, and he knew what English prayer sounded like, and he knew what Latin prayer sounded like from his years of working with Catholic chaplains in the service. The prayer Doss was speaking, alone in his quarters at 6 in the morning, was neither of those. Briscoe did not raise it again. I did not pursue it. I have thought about it many times since. I have not been able to decide whether Doss had begun to speak some language that the entities had given him in his proximity to the chamber and in the resonance that had reached the truck radio that day with Pike, or whether he had simply found in his silence with us a language that was his own, and that he had been working out in those quiet morning hours. I prefer to believe the second thing. I am not confident in my preference. Pierce became more distant. He spent more time alone in his office. He delegated more. He continued to make the decisions that needed to be made, but he made them more quickly and with less consultation. He stopped attending mess hall meals in 1986. He took his meals at his desk from a tray that was brought to him. He saw his wife twice that year instead of his usual 2 visits. He saw her once in 1987, in the spring, before the final push. He came back from that visit with a small framed photograph that he put on his desk next to the photograph of his daughters. The new photograph was of his wife. It was a recent one. She had aged a great deal in the years he had been with the program. He had aged more. I do not know what he told her about what he was doing. I do not know what she believed. I have wondered. I knew her name. I have never tried to find her. She has, by now, almost certainly passed away. Pierce died in 1998, on the same day as Holloway, and at the same age. I have always thought there was something in that coincidence. I have not chosen to investigate it. The final year of the program ran from October of 1986 through October of 1987. The quota was the same as every previous year. 47 living subjects, screened, transported, walked through the threshold. The pipeline was, by then, a thing that ran itself. I want to tell you about the last delivery. The 470th subject was a woman named Wren Osler. She was 34 years old. She had been born in a small town in Central Oregon called Sisters. She had attended Oregon State University for 2 years and had dropped out to follow a man to Portland. The man had not worked out. She had worked as a waitress for some years and as a bookstore clerk for some years and had begun in her late 20s to experience what she described in her own intake interview as visitations. The visitations were nocturnal. She believed she was being visited by figures who lived in the spaces between the houses on the street where she rented a room. The figures, she believed, were neither friendly nor hostile. They were curious about her. They came when she was sleeping. They left when she woke up. She had begun, at some point in 1983, to feel that the figures were also present during her waking hours, watching her from positions just outside her direct vision. She had stopped working. She had stopped paying rent. She had been evicted in the winter of 1984. She had drifted south. She had been picked up by our recruiter in a transient camp outside Reno in the late summer of 1987. Her chemistry was extraordinary. Her metheric acid concentration was the highest we had measured in any subject across the 10 years. Holloway flagged it in his notes. He sent the file to me personally with a small handwritten note that said, "This one matters to me. I want to be on the holding duty for her stay. Please confirm." I confirmed. Holloway met Wren Osler at the intake center in Phoenix on October 6th. He personally accompanied her transport to Lateral Site 4. He personally settled her in her room in the holding building. He chose her books himself from his usual selection, with one addition. He brought from his own quarters a hardcover copy of a book of essays by Lauren Isley called The Immense Journey, which he placed on her shelf with a small piece of paper marking a particular essay called The Judgment of the Birds. He told me, when I asked, that he had loved the book since he was a young doctor and had carried it with him for 30 years. He told me that he wanted her to have it for the 3 days. He told me that he would take it back after the handover and that he wanted me to know that he would do so. He took it back. I have it now. It came to me with the rest of his effects in 1998. The paper marker is still in it. The essay is still the one he marked. I have read the essay many times. I cannot tell you, even now, what he meant by giving it to her. I have tried to understand it. I think it has something to do with the moment in the essay when the small birds in the morning forest, after the great raven has flown away with the screaming nestling, begin one by one to sing again, and how the singing is a thing that the birds do because the morning is still the morning and the singing is still the singing, and how Isley, watching them, comes to feel that this is what life is for, that this is the practice of living things, to take up the song again after the dark visit has passed. I think Holloway gave her the book because he wanted her, in her last 3 days, to read something that someone had once given to him with love, in a circumstance where there was no love that he could give her himself, only the work that the program required of him. I think the gift of the book was the only thing he could give her. I think he understood that. I am crying as I dictate this. I am an old man, and I cry easily, and I am not embarrassed by it. I am putting this down for the record, so that you will know that Aaron Holloway was a good man who did terrible work, and who tried, in the small spaces left to him, to give the people he was killing what he could. The book was what he could give. He gave it. Wren Osler read the book in her 3 days. She read all of it, not just the marked essay. Holloway told me this. He told me she had asked him, on the second night, whether she could ask him a personal question. He had told her she could. She had asked him whether he had children. He had told her he had a son who lived in Connecticut and who was a high school history teacher. She had told him that was a good thing for a man to do, to teach history, that her own grandfather had been a history teacher in Oregon, and that he had been the kindest man she had ever known. She had asked Holloway whether his son was kind. Holloway had told her his son was kind. He had told her he had not always been a good father to him, but that the son had grown into a kind man anyway. She had told him that she was glad. She had asked him whether he would sometime write to his son and tell his son about her, and tell his son that she had said hello, that a woman named Wren Osler from Sisters, Oregon had said hello, and that she hoped his son was happy. Holloway wrote the letter the night after Wren Osler's handover. He sent it. His son still has the letter. I know this because Holloway's son contacted me in 2001, 3 years after his father's death. Having gone through a box of his father's papers and found a copy of the letter and not understood the reference, he asked me if I had known a woman named Wren Osler. I told him I had known her briefly. I told him she had been a kind person who had passed through a program his father had worked on, and that she had asked his father to send the message. I did not tell him more than that. Holloway's son thanked me for the call. He said the letter had meant a great deal to him because his father had not often, in his lifetime, spoken about kindness, or about why kindness mattered. He said the letter ended with a sentence in which his father said, "If you ever have a son, teach him to be kind, because the world will not, and someone must." He read that sentence to me over the phone. I could hear that he was crying. He apologized for it. I told him there was no need to apologize. We hung up. I did not call him back. I have thought about calling him back many times over the years. I have not done it. I do not know what I would say. The handover of Wren Osler took place on October 14th, 1987. The morning was clear and cool. The sun came up over the Pintwater Range at 6:47. There was a thin layer of frost on the ground near the perimeter fence at dawn. The frost was gone by 8. I was at the facility because I had been at the facility continuously for the last 6 weeks of the program. We were all there. Even the recruiters had been brought in. Trent was there. Linda Cole was there. The regional case officers from Atlanta and Chicago were there. Pierce had called everyone in for the last week. Reverend Doss met Wren Osler at the door of the holding building at 10:15. She was wearing the denim pants and the cotton shirt. She had washed her hair. She had eaten a small breakfast. Holloway had sat with her at breakfast. He had told me, when he came out of the holding building before her, that she had eaten a piece of toast and a soft-boiled egg and had drunk a cup of black coffee. She had told him at breakfast that she had slept well and that she had dreamed of her grandfather. He had asked her what her grandfather had said in the dream. She had told him her grandfather had said nothing. He had been standing in a yard she remembered from her childhood in late afternoon, and he had been wearing a brown corduroy jacket she remembered him wearing, and he had simply been standing there, looking at something in the distance. She had told Holloway it had been a very peaceful dream. She walked across the compound with Doss. I walked behind them with Pierce and Holloway and Riley. The walk was the same walk we had made 469 times before. The distance was the same. The light was the same kind of October light. The wind was very still. We went down the staircase together. The chamber looked the way it had always looked. The aperture was where it always was. Vance was in the monitoring booth. She had not had a drink that morning. She had told me at breakfast that she was going to do the closure sober. She had told me it was the only kindness left in her to give. Das took Ren Osler to a point about 10 feet from the aperture. He turned her to face him. He held up a card. The card had been newly written. The card had on it the King James version of the 23rd Psalm. He held the card up to her. She read it. She read it aloud in a quiet, steady voice while he held the card for her. She read it through to the end. She gave Doss back the card. She thanked him. She turned to me. She said, "Captain Brennan, I would like to thank you also. I have been told this is your last delivery as well. Holloway told me. I hope you have a peaceful retirement." She had been told it was my last delivery. I had not told her that. I had not thought she would care. She cared. She thanked me. I could not speak. I nodded to her. She turned to the aperture. She walked toward it. She did not look back. She crossed the threshold with the same slight forward lean that all of them had crossed it with, as though they were walking into a wind only they could feel. The geometry took her. The sound was the wet rope sound. It held for 3 seconds. It released. She was gone. We waited. We waited for 47 minutes. At 11:12, Riley raised his hand. He listened. He raised his hand higher, which was a signal that what he was hearing was more than the usual acknowledgement. The chamber went very still. Pierce came over to the monitoring station. Riley listened for a long time. He took the recorder off his belt. He spoke into it quietly for 2 minutes. He turned off the recorder. He took off his headphones. He looked at Pierce. He said, "Colonel, they have communicated a closing message. I would like to read it to you all if I may. I have it in good translation." Pierce told him to read it. Riley read it from his transcript. He said, "The agreement is complete in its initial term. The samples have been received and have been preserved across the conveyance. We will conduct the analysis. The analysis will require a duration that we cannot specify in your units. The aperture will close in this time. We will not initiate further communication while the analysis is in process. We will reopen if further conveyance is required, to complete the analysis or to extend the analysis to additional questions. We do not anticipate at present an early return. We do not foreclose it. We are grateful for the conveyance." He paused. He looked up at Pierce. He said, "The final phrase, sir, has a usage in their language that I want to flag. The word I have translated as grateful has a specific connotation in their grammar. It is the word they use for the gratitude one feels for a tool that has performed its function. It is not the word for gratitude between persons. I want you to understand the distinction." Pierce nodded. He said, "Thank you, Lieutenant. I understand. Is there anything else?" Riley said, "There was nothing else." The aperture began to contract at 11:19 that morning. It contracted slowly. We watched it for the next 3 days. It diminished by approximately a third on the first day, by another third on the second day, and disappeared entirely sometime in the early morning hours of October 17th, 1987. 10 years to the day after I had voted yes in that conference room on the 17th of October, 1977. The chamber that had held the aperture was, after the morning of October 17th, an empty concrete room. Vance walked into the chamber at 11 that morning. She stood at the spot where the aperture had been. She held her hand up in the place where the distortion had stood. The air there was air. The geometry there was geometry. The wall behind that spot was the wall it had always been. She took a step forward. She passed through the space where the aperture had been. She turned around. She looked at us. She said, "It is gone." She was crying. Vance, who I had not seen cry in 10 years. She was crying quietly, without any expression at all on her face. Just the tears running down her cheeks, the way water runs down a window. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She walked out of the chamber. She climbed the staircase. She went back to her quarters, and she got out a bottle of wild turkey, and she did not come out of her quarters for 3 days. Pierce assembled the team in the mess hall that evening. He did not make a speech. He thanked us. He said our work had ended. He said the closure of the site would take some months. He said our individual assignments would be handled in the coming weeks. He said he hoped we would each find some peace. He said he did not know what else to say. He sat down. Doss stood up. He came around the table. He went to Pierce. He put his hand on Pierce's shoulder. He stood there for a long moment with his hand on Pierce's shoulder. He did not speak. He had not spoken in 5 years. He squeezed Pierce's shoulder. He went back to his seat. That was the end of the meeting. I went out to the perimeter that night. I stood at the eastern fence. I looked at the mountains. The moon was up. It was a half moon. The desert was the color it was at night, a kind of pale silver gray with the shapes of the creosote and the saltbush all standing up like small dark figures. I stood there for a long time. I thought about Thomas Mercer asking to see the sun come up. I thought about Russell Pike's poem. I thought about Ren Osler thanking me. I did not weep. I had not wept since Joan died, and I would not weep that night either. I had stopped being able to weep in a way that worked. I went back to my quarters at 1 a.m. I slept for 2 hours. I got up. I started in on the closure paperwork. There was a great deal of it. The closure took 11 months. I worked on it every day. The decommissioning of Lateral Site 4 was completed in September of 1988. The buried chamber was sealed first. The concrete pour was done over 3 days by a specialized engineering team. The pour filled the chamber to the ceiling and then filled the descent shaft and then filled the access tunnel and then sealed the surface access with an additional 6-foot plug. The total volume of concrete used was approximately 340 cubic yards. The concrete was reinforced with steel rebar at intervals throughout the pour. The chamber, after the pour, was a solid block of reinforced concrete 80 feet below the surface of the Nevada desert. The above-ground structures were demolished. The administrative building, the residential quarters, the holding building, the medical office, the monitoring building, the mess hall, the maintenance shed, all were taken down, and the debris hauled away to a federal disposal site in Utah. The foundations were ground down and covered with soil. The perimeter fence was rebuilt at a wider radius. The land was officially redesignated as Soil Contamination Remediation Zone 4 under the Department of Energy's Environmental Management Authority. A small chain link enclosure was placed at the approximate location of the surface access plug, with a single sign warning of subsurface contamination. The sign was real. The site appears on department maps. It is still maintained. There is a quarterly inspection. The inspector who does the quarterly inspection has, at all times since 1989, been a person who was cleared into the program at the residual oversight level. The position is hereditary in a sense. The current inspector is a man I have never met. I know his name. I have left it with my papers. The personnel were scattered. Pierce was transferred to a position at the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington. He retired in 1992. He died in 1998 of pancreatic cancer. Vance was transferred back to Lawrence Livermore on paper. She did not actually return to Livermore. She moved to a small town in Northern California and lived alone. She continued to drink heavily. She continued to do consulting work for the department on matters I was not cleared to know about. She died in 2009. Her papers, by her arrangement, came to me. They included a sealed envelope with photographs of the aperture that she had taken in violation of protocol over the course of the program. The photographs are still sealed. I have not opened the envelope. I have left instructions about it. Holloway was transferred to a research position with the Department of Veterans Affairs. He worked on post-traumatic stress in returning veterans. He was, by all accounts, very good at the work. His patients loved him. He died in 1998 of a heart attack in a hotel room in Albuquerque. He had been on a research trip. He was 70 years old. His son, the high school history teacher in Connecticut, took possession of his effects. The notebooks and the safe deposit box, as I have said, came to me through the arrangement Holloway had made years earlier. Riley was hospitalized in 1989 with what was officially diagnosed as a movement disorder of undetermined origin. He spent 2 years at a private facility in Maryland that the program paid for. He recovered enough to live independently. He took a small house in Virginia. He lived alone. He never married. He died in 2012 at the age of 59 of complications from his ongoing condition. He left no immediate family. His effects went to the program's residual oversight office. I do not know what became of them. I have not asked. Doss returned to South Carolina. He took up residence in a small parish house that the diocese provided for retired clergy. He continued his vow of silence. He continued to write notes when communication was required. He died, as I have said, in 1991. I went to see him in the hospital. I did not go to the funeral. I should have. Sergeant Briscoe stayed in the service for 2 more years. He retired in 1990 as a sergeant major. He moved to Oregon. He bought a small piece of land on the Wallowa River and raised a few cattle and lived alone. He sent me a Christmas card every year for the rest of his life. The cards were always the same kind of card, a generic landscape image with a printed message inside, and he always wrote one line at the bottom in his careful, blocky handwriting. The line was always the same. He always wrote, "I think about all of them. Sincerely, Walt." He died in 2004. His daughter wrote to tell me. I had not known he had a daughter. He had a daughter from a marriage that had ended in the early 70s. He had not been a good father to her. He had tried, in the years after his retirement, to reconnect. She told me, in her letter, that he had become, in the last decade of his life, the kind of man she had wished he had been when she was a girl. She told me he had spoken about me sometimes. She told me he had said I was a good man. I did not know what to write back. I wrote that I was sorry for her loss, and that her father had been a good colleague, and that I would think of her in the days to come. I sent the letter. She did not write back. I was the last operational case officer reassigned. I was transferred to the Pentagon in November of 1988 to a desk job in a budget analysis office that had nothing to do with my actual background. I sat at that desk for 5 years. I read budget documents. I wrote memos. I attended meetings. I did the work the way a man does work that is meaningless. I retired in May of 1993 at the rank of colonel. I had been promoted twice in the years since the program closed, neither time for any work I had done. I moved to a small town in southern Arizona. The town had a main street and a hardware store, and a diner and a post office, and a small public library. I bought a single-story house at the end of a quiet street. I built a porch onto the back of the house. I planted a vegetable garden. I read books. I drank too much for about 3 years, and then I stopped. I have not had a drink since June of 1996. I attend a small meeting at the Methodist Church basement on Tuesday nights. I have a sponsor. His name is Walter. He has been my sponsor for 23 years. He thinks I am a retired Air Force officer who saw some hard things in his career and who is working on his peace. He is correct in everything except the size of the hard things. I drive out to the high ground above the old site every year on the 17th of October. The drive is 6 hours. I leave at 4 in the morning. I arrive a little before noon. I park at a turnout on a Bureau of Land Management road. I hike a short distance to a low rise from which the perimeter fence of the soil remediation site is visible at a distance of about 2 miles. I take a folding camp chair. I take a thermos of coffee. I take a sandwich. I sit on the rise. I watch the site. I watch the sky over the site. I stay for several hours. I am looking for something. I have not, in 27 years of looking, ever seen what I am looking for. I do not know whether that is a comfort or a warning. I have decided, over the years, that it is both. The translation Riley gave us on that final morning included the word that he translated as grateful, and I have, since the day he gave us that translation, been unable to stop thinking about his footnote on the word. He told us that the word was the one the entities use for gratitude one feels for a tool that has performed its function. I have lived with that footnote for 27 years. I have thought about what it means. A tool that has performed its function is a tool that gets put away. A tool that has performed its function is also a tool that gets taken out again when there is more work to do. The word they used for what the analysis required, the word Riley translated as duration that we cannot specify in your units, has stayed with me also. I have wondered whether they meant that the duration was very long or whether they meant that their conception of time does not map onto ours. I have decided, in the absence of any way to know, that the distinction does not matter. Either possibility leaves the question of return open. Either possibility means that, in some moment that may be soon or may be very far away, the analysis may conclude and the conveyance may resume. I am not, when I sit on that rise in October, hoping to be present for the moment. I am there because I cannot not be there. I have made a promise to 470 people whom I never met, and whose names I know, and whose files I read, and whose handovers I authorized. The promise is that I will not look away. The promise is that one person will continue, for as long as one person can, to keep his eyes on the place where the door was. I cannot do anything about it if the door opens again. I am one old man on a hill with a thermos of coffee. The opening of the door is not a thing I can prevent or effect. I know this. I have not deceived myself about it. The watching is not a defense. The watching is the only thing I have left to give to the 470. The watching is what I owe. Holloway wrote in the final entry of his 11th notebook, dated December of 1997, 2 months before his death. I have come to believe that the only thing we did right in the entire program was the small things we gave to the subjects in the holding building. The books, the food, the clean clothes, the chance to see the sun come up, the piano in the visitors' lounge, the book of essays I gave to Ren Osler. These were nothing against what we took. They were not absolution. They were not redemption. They were the only acts in which the people we were processing were for a moment treated as the persons they actually were and not as the deliveries they were about to become. I would like, in the time I have left, to be the kind of man who can extend that same regard to the people around me who are not being processed. I would like to look at the bank teller and the waitress and the cab driver and see them, even briefly, the way I saw Ren Osler when she asked me about my son. I have not been able to. I hope to learn. I do not have much time. I read that entry the first time on a March morning in 1999. I sat at my kitchen table. The morning sun was coming in the window onto the table. The coffee in my cup was getting cold. I read the entry twice. I closed the notebook. I sat at the table for a long time. I am still trying to learn what Holloway said he was trying to learn. I have not made the progress I hoped to make. I think about Ren Osler asking if I would have a peaceful retirement. I think about Russell Pike's poem. I think about Thomas Mercer's hand at the threshold. Tonight is the 17th of October. I drove out to the rise this morning. I sat in the camp chair for 5 hours. I watched the sight. I watched the sky. The wind was very still. The sun moved across the sky in its old patient way. A pair of red-tailed hawks worked the thermals over the perimeter for about an hour in the early afternoon. A coyote crossed the access road in the middle distance once. The road was empty otherwise. I saw nothing in the sky that was not the sky. I saw nothing on the ground that was not the ground. I drove back to my house this evening. I made a simple supper. I sat down at this table at 9 in the evening to record this testimony. It is now 4 in the morning. I have been speaking for 7 hours. The tape recorder on the table is the last of a series I have used over the years. The microphone is the small condenser microphone Riley used to use in the chamber, which he left to me in his will. I have used it for testimonies before. I have recorded several. I will leave them all in the same place. I have left the location with my papers. I am going to stop talking soon. Before I stop, I want to say one thing that does not belong with the rest of the file, but that I want to say anyway. If you are listening to this and you are a person who feels things that do not fit in the world as it is currently arranged, and you have been told by other people that the things you feel are wrong, and that the things you see are not real, and that the things you imagine make you sick or broken or strange, I want you to know that the very chemistry of what you are is the most valuable substance in the known universe. I do not say that as a comfort, I say it as a warning. The things you make in your head are not nothing. They are the thing that other intelligences would cross the divide between worlds to obtain. They are the thing that costs a great deal to produce, and that cannot be produced anywhere else. Do not let anyone take it from you cheaply. Do not let anyone tell you it is worth less than it is. Do not, if you can help it, fall through the cracks of the world into the places where the people are gathered who can be gathered without consequence. There are still systems, even now, that watch those cracks. There may always be. I cannot prove this. I am out of the program for many years, but I do not believe the analysis has ended. I do not believe the door is sealed in any sense that matters. Keep your dreams close. Keep them in the rooms where you live, with the people who love you. Write them down if you must. Tell them to a friend. Do not be alone in any place where no one is looking. That is all I have to say. The tape will run for another minute or so. I am going to let it run. I am going to sit here at this table in the dark in this small town in southern Arizona with the microphone on the table and the recorder spinning and the kitchen window open to the cold morning, and I am going to listen. The wind is moving in the mesquite outside the window. A dog is barking far off, somewhere across town. The refrigerator hums. That is all I hear. I am going to keep listening.